Let me see.
Hello in there! Hey, what's so important? What you got here that's worth living for?
So I'm here with my friend Ryan Payne here on To Blathe, and I just am stoked about having an opportunity to talk with you. We've had some really interesting conversations, including tonight, just at the dinner table, about life, about so much. But just to introduce you a little bit for some of our viewers, um, obviously, like any human being, you have a varied, complex identity and history, but a lot of folks know you from your involvement with the Bundys and the Bundy Ranch standoff, the Malheur Occupation. And so I was hoping to maybe have a conversation about that and then also about your own spiritual journey and how it, how you came into that, what brought you into that, and then how you've sort of your path since that time. And you share whatever you feel comfortable sharing. Um, yeah, anyway, welcome to Blathe. Thanks for having this conversation. Maybe we could just start out with what's, well, tell us a little bit about your life now. A little bit about your life now. Like, what's important to you now? Not necessarily politically, but just what's important to you? What's moving you? What's getting you up in the morning now?
I think there's like uh, phases of life,
Sure.
and probably this phase of life is defined by some of the events you mentioned, and then certainly some time imprisoned, and that's I think oftentimes a defining feature of people's lives.
Sure.
But so if I had to say, now probably is a period sort of like a rebirth right after getting out of prison, starting over, doing maybe new things, rediscovering and analyzing old things and such. So I don't know. I think the thing that, to go directly to your question, what motivates me and what moves me at this point is um, just enjoying all of the whatever presents itself at any given time. It's whether that's a business endeavor or a personal relationship um, or a more social group relationship. So I guess I like the focus and the periphery,
Okay. Interesting.
and just trying to find enjoyment in all those things. Yeah,
Sure. You've got a couple kids.
five,
Five. Five kids, and they're really cute. I think I've met them all, right?
Mhm.
And I'm anxious to get them over here. I was showing them videos of the horses and the animals and stuff. They seem pretty stoked about that. And you also, and it seems like, just following a little bit, some mutual friends, you do a good deal of, when you can, mountaineering.
Mhm.
But kind of going back to, I guess, I don't know, I'd like to navigate a little bit. This political sphere right now is a weird place.
When is it not?
When is it not? Fair enough. Fair enough. I feel like sometimes it's a little more weird.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that I often, I have, as you probably do, a full spectrum of friends. We were talking about that earlier. Friends on all sides of the aisle and all sides of different conversations, both in the sort of traditional left, right, Republican, Democrat, then also the full spectrum outside of that, whether it be communist, anarcho-capitalist, whatever. But, recently we have the I don't know what they're calling it, the Capitol assault or whatever.
Mhm.
And that seems to be sort of a focal point. People talk about the far right. Well, if you Google your name, and some of our viewers will probably Google your name, like Ryan Payne. Okay, here's a Wikipedia. Okay, here's he's a member of this, and I'm sure they'll see the term far right a lot. And so when I hear my friends talking about the far right, this, far right, that, oftentimes like any label, it doesn't do justice to the vast differences among the people it describes.
Sure.
Um,
Generalizations and
yeah, but they're still useful. But did you ever consider yourself far right? And do you consider yourself far right now? Or how does that label relate to you? Like when you see it, when you're reading an article?
yeah. First off, I think the general American political conversation is extremely narrow politically.
Sure.
That its boundaries, what it defines as far left and far right, are actually a very small facet of what's totally available in human political discussion, right? And so one thing that I found is maybe that some of I think my perspectives are so far right that they're left, and so far left that they're right.
Sure, kind of.
That
it's more of a circle than a.
I really view
horizon.
it as a circular thing, as opposed to a linear. On the far left is this, and on the far right is that, and so then everything in between, because on a circle there's no start or end.
Sure.
So every point is a far left of some other point,
Sure.
and every so I guess, and I think as we were discussing earlier, for instance, that over a fantastic dinner, by the way, thank you, that our definitions within these things are often defined by our own perspective. So if we perceive ourselves to be far right, then a position that we've been told is opposite of that we view as far left. But I think that a lot of people probably, as you said, if they just did a quick Google search, would find a lot of far right extremist sort of labels. And I think, as we discussed before, it's often been found in deeper discussion. I think I probably can be defined left in a lot of ways. So I think that generally we say, like today, maybe a libertarian is that, right? Like a socially liberal, fiscally, governmentally conservative.
Sure.
But they also mean conservative, and a libertarian means conservative in a different way than a Republican means conservative.
Sure.
And all of that is so blurry these days. So I don't know. It's difficult to define. I guess you just have to say it depends on what specific facet of politics we're discussing.
Sure.
Yeah.
So going back to those early days when you were involved or first getting involved with the Bundys and their struggle, what were some of the motives in you that propelled you into that world?
So
or ideals or whatever,
Yeah. And that is also one of those multi-level things.
Mhm.
You can have a pick which strata of the conversation are we going to engage in. But on the practical side of things, I was sort of tainted by discoveries and education about government itself, and particularly the United States government and tyranny and American ideas of liberty, contemporary to the American Revolutionary era, and came to the conclusion, and have sort of always felt a mode of service in life, that service, the greatest expression of that service is to use one's own qualities to assist their brother. Love your friend as yourself idea. And if, although I don't have the same qualities as my friend, as my neighbor, it's the opposite qualities or the complementary qualities that we have that allow us to love each other and share ourself with someone else, and allow them to share themselves with us. So I think, to boil that down, it was to be of aid is kind of the general idea. And the specific idea is that I guess, I perceived myself to have a set of qualities that could aid in the protection of people from their government. And that has also turned in large part to not simply protecting them from the government, but helping to open up doorways into educating ourselves about what freedom really is, and freeing our mind from even the notion that we're bound in some way. And the two kind of go hand in hand. What I've found is that physically trying to defend people, or offering yourself to defend people, the deeper you go into that, and the more alike we find ourselves with those who, the more we can find the similarities with those who oppose us, the more that we find we're searching for opportunities for peace. And really, our disagreements in those things are based in having exhausted all attempts at that, at finding that peace. And peace means harmony. Two things being, they aren't the same things,
Sure.
but they work together.
Work together. Yeah. I like the vision you have of the process of getting along and realizing, would you say, I mean, at the root of your endeavors, both, martial, like taking up arms, and, conversational or relational or whatever, is an idea of the unity of all people, an idea of an ultimate unity. Would you say, it seems like talking to you, like that's something that's something that's sort of a bedrock principle for you?
Clarify what you mean by
the
martial activity.
Well, like, so you've been involved in what would be generally labeled militias. Now, you're not involved in them now, but you've been involved in militias. What were basically in the revolutionary times called committees of public safety, that sort of thing. And you're much, much more educated than me on that whole history, on how they relate to our history, the government, whatever. But when I talk to you, so I guess the average person, average American, and they hear about militia, and they hear about, crazy far right people taking over, government properties or whatever, supposed government properties. The last thing on their mind is that these people have a view of loving their neighbor, of resolving differences, of peace and brotherhood among all people. When I talk to you, a lot of your ideology sounds much more sort of like, what somebody might say, like New Age or Marxist or whatever. Not the idea of a bunch of angry old white guys holed up in a cave, trying to separate themselves. Yeah. So how could you unpack that? Like, are you one of these angry white guys, or were you one of these angry white guys just who doesn't like other people that they don't understand, that are different or whatever? Because you don't come off to me as somebody like that, and it's hard for me to imagine that you ever were.
Yeah, maybe I don't seem like that now because I was at some point. I can identify those times, and of course, they arise now. I mean, I still have anger and such that I have to deal with, and that sort of thing. But there were events that sparked anger, but maybe I learned through mentorship or parenting or whatever it was to not react to anger in the moment. That anger, take your emotions and feel them and analyze why you're feeling the way you're feeling and turn that into an energy. So anger, it probably was not necessarily the motivator, but it might have been sparks here and there that fueled something, right? So I would say it's it kind of maybe boils down to the word militia in our Second Amendment and in the context of the way the founders viewed it. Uh, it comes from the Greek word militai, which means is essentially the citizen in his capacity to protect his community. So who's the militia? And then United States Code defines that pretty clearly as all able-bodied citizens who are of age. Essentially, there's some clarity to it, but what it basically says is that able-bodied citizens that can protect their community are the militia. Well, that's there are more inclusive definitions within the generality of militia, but the militia in essence includes everybody that can defend each other. And so one thing that I found within the context of the militia experience and its what appears to be a segregationist attitude, a separationist attitude. I mean, segregation as in race and such, but community to community. Well, if the militia is to defend your community, then where are the borders of your community? And so you've established some sort of separation.
Kind of a balkanizing sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that happens because of the idea that self-preservation is the goal of any entity, any living entity. Animals will fight for self-preservation. Humans are always struggling with self-preservation, the ego and such, and it's the basis of the ego. And then government as an entity its base instinct is to preserve itself in perpetuity. So when we have the sort of these separating factors, this balkanization, like you said, then it's interesting that what I've found is the things that seem to separate us the most, they reveal as you become more and more separated. It's only because you're trying to look across a greater gap to try and find something that unifies you. So you sort of, it's like, where is it at? Well, all the things that unify you are the things in between you, which are still things. Let's explore those things that are between us. And so instead of balkanization in that regard, through the separation, you can identify the points of unity. If you just stop focusing on the adversarial aspects of one another. Another means of viewing it is not necessarily just to sort of explore the periphery for opportunities for unity, but to view the adversarial nature of that which opposes you as an opportunity to view it in a positive light or redefine it. Walk in the other person's shoes and try to see what is it that they're seeing and why do they see it the way they do? Why is their perspective the way it is? And find where your meeting place is with them through their eyes as opposed to your own.
Sure.
Right? Know your enemy, as some people say.
Sure.
But to view your enemy as simply a part of yourself that is displayed outside of you that you want to get along with yourself. And at times I have to quell certain behaviors within myself that I see as enemies to myself.
Sure.
I have to refine my own behaviors, and we as a big I together, we have to refine our behaviors too together. And we have to do that in a way that we try to implement on ourselves, which is as least destructively as possible.
Right.
Yeah. Peacefully.
But sometimes that can't always be done peacefully.
Yeah, correct.
So like, for instance, today that the verdict was delivered on the Derek Chauvin trial. And
what was the verdict?
The verdict, it came out while you're driving here. So they found him guilty on all counts. So I think that's manslaughter, third degree, and second degree murder. Now obviously they're going to appeal, blah blah blah.
I watched the video. Did you see the video? Did you watch the
I didn't watch it from beginning to end. I watched enough of it to, get a gist of it. Did you watch the whole video? What did you think about that?
I mean, you were in the military. You learned things that are for the purpose of subduing another individual or worse. That's what they learn as police officers. And the difficulty always is, something that struck me in reading. Gosh, I can't even remember. I believe it's who was the. He was a captain originally. He was the guy that came up with the idea for Operational Detachment Delta Force.
Oh, Marine guy?
No, it was Army Special Forces guy.
Oh,
yeah, and
Delta Forces, Army, obviously.
Yeah, starting. So it goes through his story from Vietnam, and then the idea of to put together an SAS type of unit, British SAS, and for the United States military. Sure. And one of the things that they go through in operator training, and to bring a guy into the teams, they're very, very insular and tight. They're relying on each other intimately for each other's lives. Is that there's a characteristic that they desire, and that is such a respect for human life that you become surgical in your application of force, and particularly lethal force, because you don't really want to kill anybody. That's a desirable attribute of a Delta operator, or it was, at least in this book
earlier.
Yeah, who I couldn't tell you at this point, but the regard for human life, you'll be more careful, and you will surgically apply your abilities when you don't really want to kill the person that you might have to kill.
Yeah, I think that's an old, and I think it's a missing aspect of heroism and the sort of martial lifestyle. Everything from like King David sneaking up on Saul and not killing him.
It's an aspect of chivalry and honor.
Yeah, honor is your ability to restrain your force, as opposed to I feel like a lot of that's been lost, and now the sort of chest thumping worlds of the infantry that I was in. You're intel guy, but certainly like
infantry.
Oh, you're infantry too. Okay, so as you know, in the infantry, and I'm sure in many police forces, that is not always there, and it's a lot of just kill them all, and I'm big and tough, and I can beat anybody up.
It's interesting when I read the reports from the Oregon State Police SWAT team officers that were part of the FBI HRT effort to take us down there on the day Lavoy Finicum was killed, and so sort of what they label as the leadership of the occupation was taken down and arrested. In reading what their perception of us was, and then so we had all of this information that the government was feeding them, reading what they were feeding them and such, and I'd say, I would find myself to be an absolute danger and want to kill me as fast as possible, or at least end my involvement with any sort of social affair, if I had been reading these things about myself too. If the picture that's painted before you is black and on white, then you perceive the image before you as being black.
Yeah, about that. Obviously, the operation, for whatever it entailed, there was, it failed on the PR level. Like the average, obviously you're coming against one of the greatest propaganda machines of human history, the US federal government. Was it a matter of propaganda, or like where were they getting that black image that they were painting of you? Was that a fabrication of theirs, or was it an accident, or was it intentional? What do you feel?
Somewhat intentional.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of all of that. We do get to see the propaganda that they're fed, so they are fed. But there is a tool of I guess you could put it into the realm of psychological uh, strategy, and that is to, well, for instance, what's one of the ways that we're told that we can get a bear to run away?
Make ourselves. I don't know. What are we getting?
I mean, there's a couple different ones.
Yeah,
One
sure.
is like make yourself
Makes you look dead.
dead.
Make yourself look big and scary.
Make yourself look big and
as
scary.
big and scary as you can.
Well, in the unit that I was in, and the infantry unit was long range surveillance. So, without going into a bunch of detail, it's kind of like forward recon type of stuff, right? So you're working 6-man teams, very intimate, a long ways away. Your job consists of being a long ways away from anybody who you're told doesn't want you dead. They perceive you as an enemy. You're in their backyard watching them, perhaps lasing targets. Those types of units do that stuff. Gathering information on them, spying on them.
Sure.
And then using that information to relay to somebody else who probably wants to do them harm.
Sure.
You're in their backyard. Well, the part of being a small team in the enemy's backyard, if you want to see it that way, is that when you make contact, the most common battle drill for a LURS team is break contact.
Yeah, pop smoke.
Yeah, we need to get out of here.
Sure.
At the same time, when you watch LURS team break contact drills, it's interesting. I think that the audio is really what catches you. Visually, it's there's some good techniques and there's individual movement combined with a small unit movements. But the thing that always struck me was the audio aspect of it, and that's that the goal is to try to sound as big and awful as you possibly can. To make an anecdote very short, there was at one point where it was said, and somebody who was engaging us over a cell phone conversation, that
this is in Oregon.
No, this is in Iraq.
Oh, in Iraq.
Yeah,
okay.
we're going to get the Americans. And then there's another cell phone conversation, and they were talking to their buddies or whatever, saying, "Hey, here's what we're going to do. They're Americans. We're going to get them." It was nighttime, and they hadn't actually physically seen us. So how they determined we were Americans, I don't know. Maybe because of the 5.56 rounds as opposed to AK-47. Sure. But then it was maybe an hour later, they intercepted another cell phone conversation when she says, "We can't get the Americans. There's too many of them." Well, there had been somewhere between 50 and 75 guys sent at our team. And there was only 6 of us in the middle of the desert laying on the ground. So the goal is to be very big. Well, we face that when something you mentioned a few minutes ago, that you're facing not only the biggest propaganda machine that has ever existed in humanity, as far as we know. Right?
Sure.
I think there were others that were similar. We're just on another cycle, right? Sure. Another version of the cycle.
Sure.
But it's also the most powerful military that's ever existed. It's the most immersive government. The amount of bureaucracy and paperwork that exists in our government, there's no equal to it in history. We might like to compare it to the Russian version or the USSR and China and such, but we've got a lot of paperwork ourselves, right? Stacks and stacks and stacks of laws. So you're what a lot of people think is your adversary. I don't necessarily. It's only adversarial in the sense that the breakdown of the search for a peaceful solution exists. But I think we towed right up to a peaceful solution existing both times.
Really?
At least certainly in Nevada, just walked up to present to them that, look, we don't want any violence, or we don't want any harm to come to anybody, but you are putting so much pressure on life and liberty that it may not be that we become violent, but it may be that we will not stand idly by while you do what you do, to the point that you feel like, because of your training or your mission or the propaganda you've been fed, that you become violent towards us, which often happens.
Sure.
When people who stand for liberty and their livelihoods and things like that present themselves as a sort of a active resistance, if you will, that is non-violent. Look at Gandhi.
Yeah, or like even recently, the Standing Rock. They were rubber bullets, water cannons, dogs. I mean, they were all very peaceful.
So sort of bluster, I guess, if you would say, is sort of the tactic. It's to say we're not actually as big and bad and quite inactive, frankly, as far as patriotic Americans fighting for liberty and such mostly aren't. And so since that's the case, and the idea is to protect the people that you're there to protect from that big bad, what everybody thinks is a big bad wolf of tyrannical government, if they perceive it that way, then one of the means with which you can protect is to create a sphere, the illusion of a huge bear that can be ready at any moment, because I found it lacking. And so the implementation of this was, a discussion amongst people, and sort of, it wasn't done without counsel, but the decision is difficult because we also believe in truth, utter truth, trying to seek the truth to the utmost. So deploying a tactic of deception, like the myth that you're overly well coordinated, and you're manned up and you have a huge force and they're all in communication. That is a morally irregular approach in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah,
but it's effective.
It's effective. So what you're saying is that a lot of the image. So you said, you read these reports of, say, the FBI or whoever, and they're talking about you guys, and you're going, gosh, yeah, well, these guys sound horrible. Oh, that's us. But a lot of that you're saying was basically of your own doing, because you were projecting this image of being.
If we get into specifics like that, but as far as like framing the personalities and things of that nature, they had to forcibly uncontextualize the rest of the conversation in order to paint the picture that ultimately the operator, the SWAT guys, and HRT were getting. They had to really remove, a large part of our humanity and our individual perspectives and lives and all of that, in order to say that this is an inherently violent group of people or an individual. They really had to ignore the side of us that not only talked about pursuing peace in the utmost, up to the point at which the other side decides that we're going to engage. Not only did we talk about it, but we towed that line. Individually, I feel like I did that, and I think if you had to call there to be a group or a group effort, the main facet of the group effort corporately was the safety of every individual, including federal agents, police, everybody, the government, because ultimately we're all on this earth, and we have to try to get along as hard as we can and preserve life, because
we're connected in some way.
Even in our adversarial nature, we're connected.
Sure. I would love to, mine your thoughts about a lot of that stuff. One of the things that's been on my mind today, and I'd like to get your take on it, So you're a student of Kabbalah now. Um, you're ethnically Jewish, aren't you? You grew up in your family or something.
I didn't grow up Jewish. To my understanding and sort of revelations about family history and stuff, we're, so ethnically Jewish. But I would say more or less a student of Kabbalah, and I do practice certain facets of Judaism as a possible entry into that religion in its totality as a fully observant Jew. But at the moment, I'm more attached to the spiritual aspects of it, the kind of the inner core of Judaism.
I like your take on. So when this verdict went out, one of the things that I've been really pondering, is the question of justice. Two facets of it. One, sort of between man and man, or between humans, and then that as an analogy for sort of justice, like God's justice. And my conviction is that people often have a misunderstanding of that. But so, in the anticipation of this verdict, we got a guy that died. What was his name? Floyd, George Floyd. And there's a lot of talk about we want justice. And then with the verdict came this sort of expected, the family's happy that there's some kind of justice. How do you take, what's your perspective on that idea of justice? Somebody else, somebody's received some kind of pain, suffering, hurt, deprivation. They've been stolen from, they've been killed, whatever. That somebody who is involved in perpetrating that, suffering somehow, that is justice. Well, I don't know. I guess, what does justice mean to you?
So the word justice, we say the just one, or whatever, is essentially the same as righteous in Hebrew. And so it's interesting that the word for charity, tzedakah, is the same word, tzedek, and it's the feminine of that. So tzedakah, charity, in the Hebrew thought process is justice. Why is it justice? It's because the thought there is that this certain money or livelihood or whatever your increase, you want to define it as, that comes to you is yours. And then there's a certain portion of it that is never yours. It's not your possession. It's the possession of someone else. And it's simply that you were the chosen vessel through which you were entrusted with that. It was given to you in trust that you would pass it off correctly. And so that's where we get sort of the commandment of 10% and these other things. So the idea of justice is simply to allocate correctly what Hashem, God, the universal unified force, has allocated. What did he create? Nothing is created without a purpose. And so therefore, when it comes into being, it's sent on a trajectory from his intention. Mm-hmm. And when it lands in its place, that's justice, whatever that is. Whether some people consider that, one thing to be evil, another, like perhaps the jury did in the family, and to say, well, this is justice, because they perceived that the landing place of all of this would be some sort of punishment on someone, Derek Chauvin, who did something evil. Therefore, some ramification has to come of that. And so that's their perception of justice. I could say that I think it's much broader than most people perceive it. My perception of justice is much broader, in the sense that I believe in a singular force that is not limited by our notion of the universe, and that it is present everywhere within its creation, because its creation is an expression of the attributes of itself. In believing that it is an eternal thing, so it's unlimited, it's undefined, it's infinite, uh, and that it is everywhere present because of its infinity, then its justice and its goodness, which we say are its inherent qualities, are also omnipresent and eternal. So, therefore, at all times, justice exists. It's simply not because of the limitation of time. And we sort of, I think we discussed, the gentleman earlier mentioned the constraints of a linear perspective of time, that we're given by our sort of moment to moment interaction with reality. It causes us to not be able to see. It conceals justice from us in the eternal aspect. So we say that justice doesn't exist now because we haven't experienced how that turns into justice. But in a more eternal mindset, there's no time there. That being, that creator, is infinite. So therefore, the justice is never constrained by time, and the justice is equally as infinite. Interestingly, just as a to add some definition from my understanding of teachings of Kabbalah and Judaism, which sort of form my worldview, that justice is a center line between judgment and mercy. One way of saying that would be that justice is judgment tempered with mercy, or mercy tempered with judgment. That mercy and judgment are two extremes, and justice is their shalom, their harmony, their harmonizing factor.
That's interesting, because I tend to often hear, and it doesn't sit right with me, as justice being opposed to mercy.
Right.
But if you have judgment as opposed to mercy, and justice is how they resolve, because I mean, I don't know. To me, it just seems silly, the notion that God would suspend his justice when he's being merciful, or suspend his mercifulness when he's being like.
Justice is the inclusion of both.
Yeah.
Just judgment is severe. It's strict. It defines. It helps expose definition. Expose an object through defining it. Whereas mercy sort of erases strictness and severity and such, and justice is a little bit of both. It's definition with the ability to expand beyond its limitations.
That's interesting. I'll have to chew on that. We'll have to talk again about that. Going back to the sort of present, I don't know how long we're at. We'll probably should wrap up eventually. But whatever, we'll talk as long as we want. It's my darn show. Going back to the political sphere, one of the things that irks me is, if you were to just sort of watch TV or whatever, you see, on either side, left or right, Fox News, Hannity, or, CNN, and, either side. One would get the idea that you have way over here, like BLM, Black Lives Matter, the folks that were maybe, in Minnesota, Maxine Waters is out there talking to them. They feel disenfranchised. They bear the weight of years and generations of unfairness, of oppression. So that's one whole scene. And you have your sort of average garden variety Republicans tend to think of them as this like horrible menacing threat, because there's been a lot of destruction, with looting and whatever, that like any large group, it's not unified. There's people looting here, there's people that, you can't just pin it all on anybody.
Give specific examples that taint the view of everyone.
The whole group. But there's that whole group, right? Then there's, various militias in the mountains of Idaho, trying to protect their ranches, trying to promote understanding of constitutional principles, And it's your garden variety Democrat, which you see that's a real dangerous group. They're up there, a whole bunch of white supremacists, crazy fascists, and mouth breathing, cave trolls that just have guns and want, whatever. But I know some of these BLM types, Antifa types personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some of these liberty militiamen up in the mountains. And sure, any group, big category, right? There's a whole spectrum of people, selfish, whatever, plenty.
Takes all types.
Takes all types, right? But among these people, what's annoying to me is the enormous common ground between particularly those two groups.
Yeah.
And what's annoying is just to me that there's so much common ground, and they're portrayed as sort of the opposite ends of the spectrum. Do you see any hope of like communicating between these two groups and resolving those differences, or the perceived differences, and of working together to promote the common goals of justice and ending government oppression, ending police abuses, all that?
BLM was kind of just getting going, had some significant effect, I guess, or publicity shortly before we went to Oregon with the Malheur effort there. And one of the things that was discussed was that we need to interface with these folks, because while division is the tool of what we would say the enemy,
Sure.
Division and
tyranny,
separation, divide and conquer.
Sure.
Darkness ultimately hides those connecting facets of ourselves. So you want to veil the possibility of connection between two groups in order to keep them disunified,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can more easily control both.
Sure.
And not allow social movements like that. Let's call, I don't know that the militia movement itself is a social movement, but it is a part of society, I guess.
Sure.
But let's say the foundational principles American movement.
Sure.
Patriot is even becoming a cliche at this point. So, and there are facets of the BLM movement, I think the broader range, and the sort of patriot movement that have unifying principles that are obscured through the use of propaganda and misinformation in order to keep them divided. But when you identify those things, it's kind of like we were saying earlier, that we need to look at the chasm between us and explore. If I'm standing on one side of a canyon and you're standing on the other side of a canyon, and we're like, you measure the distance between us, it's actually larger than simply the vertical distance. It's this giant canyon.
Journey you'd have to take, sure.
It's like we're constantly throwing rocks down in the canyon to see how far away from we are from each other based on the vertical separation, and we're adding all that in.
Mm-hmm.
When I can just look across and yell at you and be like, hey man, how's it going over there? Mm. And so we're focused on the chasm as opposed to exploring individuals and fostering relationships, which is one aspect of this sort of conversation forum that you're having here. And
sure,
hey, let's bring various people with various mindsets together and see how they think. And let's identify where we're different and let's identify where we're similar.
Sure,
we'll meet on our similarities, and the places where we're different will probably provoke deeper and more thoughtful conversation than our similarities will.
So how did that go? Were you guys able to make any headway reaching out to any of those groups, or was it just?
To answer your question, I think we need to, your previous question, I think that we need to focus on our similarities, what you're getting at. You notice that they're similar. I noticed they're similar as well. A lot of us did while we were initially in the Oregon jails. There were some BLM leaders in there. We were able to converse
Really?
and talk about exactly that issue. Um,
Anything
and
come of that?
yeah, I think things have come of that.
Good.
But there's also a lot of that stuff, because it's shrouded in so much propaganda and garbage and the whole divide and conquer
Sure.
aspect of it. What they're really trying to promote is this revolution of the proletariat, so that the elitists, the people who want to be in power, can ride that wave into consecrated positions of power. So they're trying to foment rebellion against the system throughout various aspects of society, whether that be BLM or its opposite, the the right wing fascists,
Sure.
white supremacists as they're labeled.
Sure.
So they're really trying to foment them all rejecting the system. But did it work? I think there's things that came out of it. I know that they continue to put out that there's a lack of unity there.
Mm-hmm.
But I do hope and I believe that there are people who are trying as hard as they can to foster that unity and say the enemy is not the things that divide us. The enemy is the thing that divides us. It's not the subjects. Those things are the things that make us unique.
Sure.
And that we can value about one another. Maybe we're still tribal enough to the point, and maybe we're meant to be, that we don't live directly harmoniously with one another, which is what a city environment kind of forces on you.
Sure.
As opposed to a rural one, where in rural communities you find a lot more a respect for the other individual's rights. My neighbor has what they do and stuff, and
sure, it's their ways. And
yeah,
these are our ways.
We're cool with that.
Yeah.
Whereas in a city setting where you're forced, it's not like you're forced. You're doing it to yourself if you want to live there. But your proximity with a bunch of different personalities sort of forces you to have to get along, and tolerance and all those other things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's also easier then to create havoc within that environment.
Well, I'm still hopeful. I think it would be amazing to be able to bridge that gap between Antifa, BLM. These are organizations, if they're organizations, groups, movements, whatever. I mean, their goals there's so much overlap. And if you just take one aspect, the sprawling US police state, that's a big problem for both sides, right?
Right.
And what you have really, to me, it's not BLM, Antifa on one side and these, militiamen on the other. It's BLM, Antifa, and the militiamen on one side, and then your garden variety Republicans and Democrats on the other, both of whom for one reason or another, either because of privilege or because of propaganda or tradition or whatever, don't see any problem, right? They just think everything's fine. If you behave yourself, things will go fine. The government's on our side. They're trying to help it. It's we the people. The police machine is out there to preserve and protect. And if so, I mean, in that whole spectrum, how do we speak the truth into that whole dynamic? Who can we wake up? Because we're all asleep in some respects, right? We all have areas that we see clearly and other areas that we're seeing cloudily, right? But who can we try to wake up?
I don't know. I guess
your personal mission, like what
the difficult part is determining when we're like, when and why do I feel like I'm awake enough to try and wake you up? Like, am I so sure of my own enlightenment that I'm going to destroy your life with it? You know,
Right.
um, and that's a delicate thing, right? It's a projection.
Sure.
At what point am I? So I think a really thorough self-analysis, reality check, taking a lot of counsel, um, developing good relationships that are open and honest. A friendship is open and honest, where you can receive information about yourself just through the interaction, and you can analyze your own um, character and behaviors through your interaction with others. If we're taking the time to do that, and instead of projecting so much, spend a lot more time receiving.
Hmm.
And when the choice is made that there's a particular projection that can be effective, it should only be done with great consideration and an approach that has humility as its beginning and end points.
Man, I think that's a good word to end this conversation on. I hope to get to talk to you again many times, and maybe again on the show here. Humility is the beginning and end point of that kind of interaction. I think that really hits the nail on the head. Thanks for joining me, man. Thanks for having this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, if you have any particular questions or thoughts about this conversation or questions for Ryan, feel free to put them in the comments below. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook, if you could subscribe, I'm not sure what that does, but that's how we measure our success in this venture, is the number of subscribers on YouTube. And everybody wants success. I'm obviously have zero intention ever of any kind of monetization on this thing. My goal is we're talking about the conversation, building those bridges and trying to bring out the truth through all this sort of loud clanging of propaganda and frothing ideologies. But one way to know we're reaching people is for them to subscribe on YouTube, and that motivates the whole project.
We've never had the opportunity for connection that we do now.
Yeah,
That's the
it's
beauty.
exciting time, isn't it?
We have to harness it, and every opportunity for unifying and connection. That's what will overcome those barriers and uncover the darkness that hides our ultimate unity.
Amen.